The spate of violence is continuing across the Palestinian territories and Israel. Over the last month, at least 27 Palestinians and 8 Israelis have been killed and dozens more wounded. So is a new uprising on the way? How will it be different from the previous ones? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. After years of relative quiet in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, daily acts of violence are once again becoming the norm. It's led some people, perhaps prematurely, to label this a third intifada or uprising. The last intifada ended 10 years ago, and despite the differences between then and now, very little has changed for a new generation of Palestinian youth. We'll try to examine just what is happening on the ground and where it's headed. But first, Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna sets up our discussion from West Jerusalem.
The growing Israeli perception is that no place is safe. Every bus station, every street corner is the scene of potential attack. And unlike previous surges of Palestinian resistance, this time there are no organizers to arrest, no chain of command to cut. And this, say many analysts, is what is different about this particular series of events. It is very different from the last intifada. That was highly organized, a series of coordinated explosive attacks taking place throughout Israel over a long period of time. Then as well, senior levels of Palestinian leadership were involved. This time, they have largely, to date, kept their distance from these attacks. So certainly the level, the scale of what is seeing now is very different from the second intifada. However, the psychological impact of these events cannot be overestimated.
So there are some obvious parallels and differences with previous Palestinian intifadas. The first began in 1987 and started when an Israeli army truck crashed into 2 vans, killing 4 Palestinian workers. It largely took the form of civil disobedience and stone throwing. The second intifada began in 2000 and was triggered by then opposition leader Ariel Sharon's visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. It became an armed uprising that would involve all Palestinian factions. Both intifadas took many by surprise and, as Mike was just saying, were coordinated by political leaders who mobilized large parts of Palestinian society. So let's now bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. In London, Aitamad Muhana Mata, Research Fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Centre. In Jerusalem, Menachem Klein, Professor of Political Science at Bar Ilan University. Menachem also wrote the book Lives in Common, Arabs and Jews in Jerusalem, Jaffa and Hebron. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, Director of the Arab-Israeli Program at the United States Institute of Peace. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Menachem, in Jerusalem, if I may begin with you. As Mike mentioned in his report, what we've seen in the last few weeks are random lone wolf attacks, a disenchanted and disillusioned Palestinian youth protesting. So can we characterize the events of these last few weeks as an uprising or the beginning of an uprising, in your opinion?
In my view, it is a new uprising, or at least chapter 2 of the second intifada, Al-Aqsa Intifada. Actually, Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa, connects this one to the previous one. Although the second intifada was implemented by armed groups, spread all over the territories without a general command. Now it is by lone wolf individuals, mainly from Jerusalem, but many others confront settlers and Israeli checkpoints all over the West Bank. Definitely it is an uprising, and it reminds us the Arab Spring, because the same generation is out to confront the ruler. And in Israel-Palestine, we have 2 rulers, Abbas in the West Bank and Israel over Abbas, which Abbas is unfortunately is subcontractor of the Israeli government.
So are you saying then that the Palestinian youth that have been protesting are not just protesting against the Israeli occupation, but also against their current leaders?
Definitely. Abbas lost control over this generation, and this generation goes out to confront settlers and the Israeli soldiers, despite Abbas' call for them and his security trial in certain places to prevent them reaching the checkpoints. So it is kind of a revolt against Abbas, and Abbas is intelligent enough to know that and not trying to stop them by force.
All right. Itamat in London. Now, you lived through the first and second Intifada. You were there. You experienced it. Tell us about how it was then, and what do you see as the differences and similarities between the situation then and now?
Yeah, I always believe that history is not going back within the same shape. So what's going on in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and also extended to Gaza could be named Intifada, but definitely its content, the shape of such uprising led by young people, individuals, is going to be definitely different than the first and the second Intifada. The major reason or the main difference between the current forms of resistance that is used by desperate, frustrated young Palestinians is the level of or the intensity of anger and their desire to preserve their sense of a human dignity is what leading them to take such a violent form of resistance, because they lost any hope to use other forms of resistance that would lead to a little change in the abstracted process of peace negotiation or recognition of the international community to the basic rights of Palestinians.
So you believe that the Palestinian youth that we're seeing protesting...
but different.
You believe that the Palestinian youth that we're seeing protesting today are more angry than those of your generation because they lack leadership?
Yeah, definitely they are much more angry than the generation of the first Intifada and the second Intifada, because since 1987, since the first Intifada, or at the end of the first Intifada, we've been going into the peace process. We've been, the Palestinian leadership have been very pragmatic and believed to make compromises and provided so much compromises. The Israelis, supported by the international community, insisted to ignore the Palestinian interest to go on with peace negotiation. They ignored the killings of Israelis, the atrocities of Israeli occupation. They haven't done any changes in the discourse of peace that they've been talking about, and they all just taking their hand out of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and leave it under the control of the right-wing Israeli government, where Palestinians have no hope that it will take a different direction. It becomes much more right-wing. It's supporting extremist settlers who are acting the same way as Palestinians, and they are not presented in the media as terrorists.
Okay, well, let's hear from Lucy in Washington, D.C. Lucy, you know, to be fair, attacks and demonstrations against Israelis have taken place very frequently, I mean, since the 1970s. And this term, intifada of uprising, is often bandied around as soon as there's a rise in tension between Israelis and Palestinians. We've seen this in the last few years. Do you get a sense that it's different this time around, that we are indeed experiencing the beginning of an uprising?
You know, I've been struck by this conversation of the last few weeks. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about, is this an intifada? Is it something different? Are we there? And in some ways, I think the conversation at a certain point becomes academic and misses the point. I think, as Etimad mentioned, and Menachem also touched on, the first Intifada was different again than the second Intifada. I think, the point of asking the question, I suppose, is to look at if we are looking at a pivotal point. Have we reached a point of no return where the genie can't go back in the bottle? What you're certainly seeing, and both Menachem and Etimad have touched on it, is a manifestation of a deep sense of despair on the part of the Palestinians. And in some ways you can see what the current violence is starting almost back last summer. You were seeing very high tensions in East Jerusalem, which is really sort of the epicenter of where you're seeing the violence now. That violence kicked up. There was then somewhat of a lull. In some ways you might be seeing this as somewhat of a continuation, where maybe what is characterizing this next round of uprising is different waves of violence. As has been pointed out, this doesn't seem to be a coordinated effort. There are it's marked by lone wolf attacks. In some cases seem somewhat spontaneous. But I think what we're seeing here is that in the wake of the latest round of collapse and negotiations, despair really has set in, and there is a sense that absent some movement out of the political status quo, if at least this isn't going to be a sustained round of violence, this is something that you might see lull, but will certainly pick up again and will not go away absent some significant moves towards creating a future trajectory.
Itamad, what is the current attitude? What are the current attitudes among Palestinians towards an uprising? I mean, again, what we've seen are young people taking to the streets. What about the older generation of Palestinians? Do they want an uprising today? Do they feel that this is the only way to gain change?
Definitely, Palestinian leadership do not wish that things will lead to a third uprising, and they wished, including Hamas leaders, they wished that the peace process would go on with reasonable outcomes. But
we heard Mahmoud Abbas say at the United Nations that he rejected the Oslo Accords, that, as far as he was concerned, Oslo was dead. So are they really interested in a peace process still?
Yeah, I mean, if Abbas reached to a point who has been supporting peace negotiation and provided so much compromises that made him losing part of his popular constituency, say this, and some Palestinians wish him to say that he wants to stop security coordination with the Israelis, but he didn't. It's a very sensitive issue at the current time. But I'm saying that leadership has no power to go on with peace negotiation or wishing not to have a popular uprising, because people are rejecting the Palestinian leadership that goes on with peace negotiation or is willing to go on with peace negotiation, not on just basis, and they don't trust the Israelis anymore. Right. So Palestinian leadership doesn't have anything to do at the current time.
Menachem, do you agree with Itamad that the current Palestinian leadership and the PA in particular doesn't want a third uprising today?
Definitely, I fully agree. They prefer a peace process with results, not a process for the sake of the process, but a process that starts with the end game, and then the negotiations are over the question how to reach them. But I would like to add my view, and my view is that the Palestinian society in general, not only the old generation and the establishment, but also the young generation, is divided, atomized, and here is the big failure of Mahmoud Abbas. He failed, or even did not try to build a political community, a polity, and even Fatah is divided. So therefore, there is no institution that can now take the lead and tell the Palestinians and the young generation in particular, see, this is our vision, this is a strategy. Abbas failed to put forward plan B. He has only one plan in his mind, he reached a dead end a year ago when John Kerry talks failed, and he is left without plan B. And this is the big failure of Abbas.
What about from the Israeli perspective? I mean, what is the strategy as far as Israel is concerned? Is it maintaining the status quo, as the Israeli Prime Minister says, or do they want more? And what do Israelis make of this latest bout of violence?
The Israeli population is shocked, and there is much of fear among the Israelis. There is panic and fear, and it's understandable. The Israeli government, Netanyahu, there are many others to the right of him, but Netanyahu wants to restore the status quo. He is in favor of conflict management. The Israeli establishment in general lived under the illusion that the status quo, the conflict management, is sustainable for many years to come, and then slowly they can annex much of the West Bank and expand settlements, gradually. And this situation now, it's for the time being at least, is over. There is no way to continue with the conflict management. What is needed, either a full war or a different strategy, a political solution, and let the Palestinians in Jerusalem to build up their own regional leadership. Israel closed down any institution in East Jerusalem that is beyond the immediate neighborhood.
Right.
So we see now the bad fruits of this policy.
Lucy, in D.C., do you, as Menachem, agree that the current status quo that Israel wants to maintain cannot be maintained, and that we have reached indeed a point of no return where something is going to have to make or break, if you will?
I do agree with Menachem. I mean, I think the irony of this term status quo has long been that things never remain static, particularly when there is no diplomatic or political movement. As soon as there is that kind of vacuum, and we've seen it time and again over the long course of this conflict's history, something and someone comes in to fill the vacuum, and that tends to be spoilers all around. And so I don't think the status quo is sustainable. I think that you're going to continue to see a deterioration in conditions on the ground until some kind of plausible meaningful way forward is found. And that's both for the Palestinian leadership, the Israeli leadership, and will also, of course, engage the U.S. and the international community.
You say a deterioration of the situation. Itamad, in London, the last two intifadas, the first and second intifada, led to some Israeli concessions. We saw the Oslo Accords, of course, and the Gaza disengagement, from Gaza. Do you think that if the current situation spirals out of control and deteriorates, we're likely to see a concession from the Israelis yet again?
At a short term, I don't think so, because what's going on in Palestine, Israel, is not separable from what's going on in the region, and any changes in the region, particularly the war in Syria, would affect the power, the persistence of Israeli policies towards Palestinians. I don't see any prospect for the Israeli government, which is clearly supporting settlers and religious groups inside Israel, to go a step back and to rethink about its policies. The major problem that they don't see this starting of an uprising would lead to further and further radicalization of young men and women in the Palestinian society, which would make life unbearable for both Israelis and Palestinians, I guess, at the shorter term. So, no, I'm not optimistic, unfortunately, about the politics in the whole region, but also about the politics of the Israeli government.
Menachem, same question to you. If the situation deteriorates, and we are indeed seeing a third uprising, a third intifada, will Israel be forced to make concessions, as they did in 2005 with the disengagement in Gaza?
In the long run, yes, but the Israeli psyche is what does not work with force will work with more force. And the Israeli government reaches the right conclusions after exploiting all other options. So I don't expect them to come to the right conclusions immediately. They will try to use more force, perhaps later on with the awakening of the West. I would say, first and foremost, the United States. The United States abandoned the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is needed to go back with West Europe. So with the help from outside, it may put pressure on the Israeli right-wing coalition when they face that they have no answer, and the public expect them to come up with a solution.
Do you think, Lucy, there's any interest, or perhaps not, interest might not be the right word, but given that the U.S. is involved in Syria right now, there's sort of a proxy war going on in Syria between the U.S., Russia, and you know, it almost seems as if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has taken a back seat as far as the Americans are concerned.
So, you know, one thing is, as you mentioned, the regional dynamics have been such that it has seemed over time, and that's been the case over the past few years, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has taken a backseat in many ways to what is seen as more pressing issues going on in the region. I think what we're seeing now, though, what we saw last summer, is just a reminder that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is never really able to take a backseat. It'll find its way back into the spotlight for good or ill, one way or the other, and this is why I think it will continue, along with many other reasons, to be a U.S. priority. I don't think they've stepped away. And I do think that what is certainly clear is that President Obama and Secretary Kerry certainly seem to have been weighing whether or seem not so inclined to jump back into sort of going back to the negotiating table. But I do think that this is an issue that does remain close to the minds and hearts of both President Obama and certainly Secretary Kerry. And so the question is, with a little over a year left in administration, will they turn their attention to it once again?
Right, and what are they likely to do, given the regional context, as you've said yourself? And I mean, if the situation deteriorates further, will we see the Americans putting more pressure on Netanyahu, which they have? And the question being, though, will he listen?
Right. Well, certainly in the mix here is the soured relationship that you've seen over the last number of months between the U.S. and Israeli administrations, which has certainly created a challenge. I do think that certainly at points like this is when there tends to be a confluence of realization between all the stakeholders, that's the U.S., the international community, and certainly the Palestinian-Israeli leadership, so that it is not in anybody's interest to see this kind of situation deteriorate further. So sadly, sometimes this kind of conflagration or threat of further conflagration can provide some impetus to move forward, to create some kind of diplomatic or political momentum.
Menahem in Jerusalem, Lucy says it's not in anyone's interest to see this kind of situation. Do you think that leaders on both sides, Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders, are willing and able to calm the current situation?
In the Palestinian side, he is willing but mostly unable. In the Israeli side, he is able but unwilling. But the key element is the circumstances. And the circumstances can force both of them, with the help of the United States, exploiting the right circumstances, I would say so. The bloodshed is not so right, but the sides may later on be ripe to make concessions and go back to negotiation if Abbas, I may say, if Abbas stays in power. Okay. And here, this is a big question. I don't have a view on it.
There is a big question mark over the future, of course, of the Palestinian Authority. Itamad in London, you have the last word. Do you think that there is hope of an end in sight, or are we going to see further violence that could last for a couple of years?
I mean, as a Palestinian, I feel so sad to say that if there is no substantial atoms or concrete actions taken by the international community to pressurize Israel, there would be more and more violence that is so hard to be controlled. We don't need to, I mean, what's going on by ISIS or by other jihadist Islamist group if the international community doesn't do anything. So it gives the legitimacy for young Palestinians to use different means, different violent actions to, again, defend their right to live as equal human beings.
Thank you. We hear what you're saying. Thank you so much, Aitamad. Thank you for your thoughts. Aitamad Muhanna Matar in London, Lucy Kurtzer, Ellen Bogan in DC, and Menachem Klein in Jerusalem. Thank you all for taking part in this edition of Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the program's page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Foliba Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.